Hello, today is stage one of the budget and my colleagues and I have just delivered Labour's offer to the SNP. We want them to deliver on jobs and growth for Scotland, but frankly we don't think that their plans to cut colleges and to cut housing are going to deliver for Scotland. We believe that the Cabinet Secretary can use the full £331 million in autumn statement consequentials available to him to invest in housing, and that would make a real difference to addressing housing need, but also to employment, to guaranteeing apprenticeships and to helping small businesses in Scotland. We further think that he absolutely has to reverse the cuts to colleges. At a time of mass unemployment, we cannot be shutting the door to anybody who wants to retrain and upskill to make themselves more employable. And finally, we want him to restore the rail infrastructure investment that he cut to the Edinburgh-Glasgow improvement line. We believe that this would make a huge difference to the people of Scotland. These are three reasonable and affordable options which we've proposed to the SNP. So far, he says he wants to reach out across the chamber. He's not showing many signs of doing so, but we're there if the SNP are willing to work with us.
Colin Ken Macintosh, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it seems that each time I speak in a debate with Mr Swinney, I begin by acknowledging that on the face of it, at least, there is more that unites us than divides us. In this case, we acknowledge that the Cabinet Secretary has had to deal with a difficult financial settlement from the coalition government and an unwelcome backdrop of international economic uncertainty. Unfortunately, however, much as we are united in disagreeing with the wrong-headed austerity economics approach of George Osborne, we are divided on Mr Swinney's mistaken assumption that there is nothing he can do. We are divided on the notion that this Parliament cannot make a difference. And fundamentally, Presiding Officer, we are divided on the SNP's claim that this is a budget for jobs and growth, when all the evidence points to the contrary. In fact, if I may remind members, 12 months ago, the previous budget, the Cabinet Secretary pledged that his budget would, quote, accelerate economic recovery, support economic growth and improve public services in Scotland. But what did it really achieve? A £66 million cut from the housing budget, further crippling the Scottish construction industry, a £52.5 million cut from the colleges budget, leading to fewer places for tens of thousands of students. And the overall impact of this so-called budget for jobs, 30,000 public sector jobs gone, 1 in 4 young people out of work, and long-term unemployment rising faster in Scotland than in any other part of the United Kingdom. In the face of this evidence as to his handiwork, Presiding Officer, this year offered the Cabinet Secretary at least the opportunity to revisit his thinking. But no, sure enough, Mr Swinney again promised us a budget for jobs and growth, when he is doing little more than tinker around the edges of George Osborne's austerity plan. It is a convenient soundbite, nothing more. Even in this Parliament, where there is an inbuilt government-supporting majority on every committee, the Finance Committee refused to endorse the suggestion this was a budget for jobs and growth. And yet, Presiding Officer, that is exactly what we need. 2 weeks ago, this Parliament united in recognising the scale of the problem of youth unemployment in this country and the scarring effect it has on young people. Just this weekend, I had another constituent come to one of my surgeries with a familiar story of frustration bordering on despair at his inability to secure a job. What frustrated me was his experience of a system which left him feeling even more vulnerable, and indeed that he was somehow to blame, alongside his practical difficulty in accessing college training or reskilling courses that would boost his confidence and employability. The Cabinet Secretary has pledged again and again that unemployment is this government's priority, but it is not just that the Cabinet Secretary has failed to make a difference, it is that his actions simply do not match his words. Last year, the Cabinet Secretary was forced into an 11th-hour U-turn on cuts to college funding. But despite that, the college budget was still slashed by £52 million, with the result that there are 70,000 fewer people at college this year than there were 3 years ago. And quite frankly, Presiding Officer, that's a staggering indictment of SNP policy. As the Cabinet Secretary so often reminds us, government is about choices. This year, the SNP's choice is to hammer colleges yet again. And let's be in no doubt, this choice has not been forced upon them by Westminster. This is a decision made in Scotland. The result will be the denial of further education for thousands more Scots of all ages and yet longer college waiting lists. We believe that the £35 million needed to reverse the cuts to further education can be found from a combination of forecast underspend, efficiencies and savings, such as on the 16 referendum work streams, or profligate government vanity projects like the Ryder Cup junket or the Scotland House fiasco during the Olympic Games. If this was truly a budget for jobs and growth, the government would be investing in colleges and investing in our young people's future. Scottish Labour believes in investing in these young lives, and we call on the government, even at this late stage, to reverse its cuts to colleges and to support our beleaguered further education sector.
Bruce Crawford.
Sorry, Mr Crawford. Oh, no intervention from Mr Crawford. Mr Crawford is clearly happier making interventions from a sedentary position, but when challenged, finds, oh, Mr Crawford, thank you.
Bruce Crawford.
The member read out some areas where Labour would make some cuts, but in her Cuts Commission speech, John Lamont said there's a great reward for taking hard decisions. Which of the decisions you just put forward are hard decisions? Because it's all just a flim-flam of nonsense you've just put forward.
Ken Macintosh.
I actually identified areas where the Scottish people would be delighted to see the Scottish Government make cuts, including on these trips to the Ryder Cup and Scotland House in London. Presiding Officer, many of us will have joined Shelter just before the Christmas recess when they asked us to support their campaign to find a home for the 5,500 children who are without such a basic essential of life. Housing need is reaching crisis levels, with almost 200,000 households on council housing lists across the country and almost 335,000 on housing association lists. On top of this, 62% of Scotland's social housing currently falls beneath the new Scottish Housing Quality Standard. This qualifies as a serious problem now, and one that this government has the powers to fix now. Following the UK Government's autumn statement, Mr Swinney was given capital consequentials of £331 million over 2 years. Labour believes that this money should be allocated in its entirety to Scottish house building. Not only would this address a pressing social need, such a sum would help get the construction industry working again. With sensible procurement policies, it would help provide jobs and apprenticeships, as well as boost Scotland's small businesses. We believe it could help fund an expanded retrofit programme, mid-range as well as affordable housing. This was the evidence given to the Infrastructure and Finance Committees by Shelter and the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, by the Scottish Building Federation and the Construction Union UCAT. It was a convincing and persuasive argument, which is not only why we in the Labour Party support it, but why the Finance Committee came to a similar conclusion.
John Swinney.
Mr Swinney.
Grateful to Mr Macintosh, and I just would like him to give us a little bit more detail on his proposal to allocate the £331 million capital consequentials all to housing. Will he confirm to Parliament that will mean taking allocated money away from the higher and further education sector, away from local government in Scotland, and away from essential improvements in other areas of infrastructure in our country?
Ken Macintosh.
It means nothing of the sort. And if the Cabinet Secretary would listen, not only does the Cabinet Secretary may be in denial about the cuts he's made to his own NPT programme.
Order.
Just to be quite clear, these spending priorities, which are the ones outlined for other members, Mr Swinney has outlined the commitments he made in December to additional spending using the autumn consequentials. I am suggesting that the Scottish Government's own Scottish Futures NPD programme, which is there and has the capacity clearly to fund such capital programmes, should be used for that purpose. It had the capacity because a matter of a mere few months ago, it was cut by £300 million. Now I am suggesting that he use it for the purpose. Can I suggest, Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary rather proudly talks about the way he's revisited the housing budget 4 times this year. Presiding Officer, trying to correct yourself 4 times in 1 year, in most people's book, is a frank admission of failure. But despite those corrections, rather than Mr Swinney's grandiose and overblown claim to be kick-starting a housing boom, the net result is still that the SNP are still choosing to cut £42 million in real terms from the housing budget. The whole partial restoration of his cuts confirms the impression of a half-hearted attempt at stimulating the economy. Now, turning to transport and infrastructure, this government often seems to be unembarrassable about the gap between their election manifesto promises and their record in office. But one of the most shameless broken promises in this session has been the slashing of the Edinburgh-Glasgow rail improvement budget by at least a third. This is the sort of infrastructure project that those of us who purportedly believe in a more Keynesian economic approach were united around. And I thought John Swinney counted himself in that number, but it would appear not. The Egypt investment would not just deliver jobs or help commuters. Providing good public transport is yet another way for a government to support people back into the job market. And all we in the Scottish Labour Party are asking for is the SNP to deliver on their own election promise for Network Rail to fund this investment from their rail asset base. Presiding Officer, I have set out 3 areas which are fair, affordable and which would make a genuine difference in stimulating the economy and improving the employment prospects of people across the country. I have not had time to do justice to all the areas where the Cabinet Secretary can make a real difference on childcare, on procurement, or on a properly funded flagship wage subsidy programme. And frankly, Presiding Officer, I am absolutely astonished we have yet to see the detail on this issue that the Cabinet Secretary promised in his statement back in September. My colleague Helen Eadie, building on the work of the European Committee, has identified hundreds of millions of pounds in untapped support that is potentially available through the European Union. I have hardly touched on the fact that this budget does nothing for our hard-pressed high streets. Shop after shop is closing, and yet the government insists on providing millions of pounds in support to tax-avoiding companies like Amazon, and proposes a hike in this budget in business rates of an eye-watering £172 million in
you must draw to your close, please.
If Mr Swinney's only crime was to be found guilty of making exaggerated claims, our reaction might be simply one of disapproval. But it is the failure to use the powers at his disposal and to follow through on his own economic analysis that is the most serious charge. He has the opportunity to revisit this budget. I would urge him to take that chance.
Many thanks.